right? He's talking about a time period where we're at minimum 3 years before the creation of the state of Israel. Right. So he's talking about that time period, that Zionism was that powerful, right? Really? It was that part. It was barely became a state.
It was
but
all
yet
part
barely,
of the plan.
But how is it possible that in Israel that barely by a miracle, Joseph Stalin voting for it for one thing, yet they were that powerful that they could manipulate everybody into this scheme.
And why? They used, he kind of sort of completes the circle with this anti-Semitic trope. They did it because of the Luxembourg Treaty.
Right.
Luxembourg Treaty is the treaty that gave Israel reparations. And so it was all for money in the end, and to dispossess. And then he takes on the Palestinian advocacy. He says it was there to as part of a plan to dispossess the Palestinians, steal money, and to create some sort of refuge for these evil Jews. So I wrote not really a major piece. This is my first reaction.
I wrote a letter to the editor.
Northwestern, and it was a long letter, and they took it, and to their credit. And I started getting this deluge of neo-Nazi mail.
You were like Thane Rosenberg,
right? And I got it through.
Time.
I knew it was coming through, that somebody affiliated to the university was doing it, because it came through interoffice, and you could see I was titled. So I'm getting interoffice mail that's neo-Nazi. So I went to the dean of students, this guy, Jim Carlton. And I said, I'm showing it to him. It's not deniable. And he explains to me this is something the university wouldn't really pursue. And I said, you can find out where this is coming from. Remember, these are the days of snail mail, where there would be drops, and you could trace it if you wanted to. And it just wasn't something interesting. And I'm sitting at that in his office in the Crown Center, in his beautiful office, and I'm thinking, you know what? The Jewish quota at Northwestern ended in 1970. So I'm there. It's 1977 by this point. There had only really been 2 classes at Northwestern that had graduated that hadn't been part of the Jewish quota. This guy was part and parcel of that. And he spoke very well, and he spoke as well as academics do today.
But more importantly also, not more importantly, but equally important, is that the other portions of the academy at Northwestern did not object to their colleague's book. So you would say, well, the schools filled, and Northwestern is a major research university. So there are a lot of PhDs on campus. Right. And so they might say, look, Butts might be an engineering genius, but he's got to go. we have to strip him of tenure. This is abhorrent, grotesque. We don't allow such a person here because this is a university dedicated to truth.
100% correct, except for Jews. So the same thing happened, by the way. Let's fast forward to a few months ago. On campus, a junior wrote an opinion piece in the Daily Northwestern. And she wrote that she has no problem with SJP or JVP, any of these, but she says there are lines, and from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. She thinks is one of those lines. It's hate speech because it means all of the Jews who live in that space need to be either exterminated or expelled, and that's hate speech. The next day, there's something called Deering Meadow, which is the main thoroughfare of Northwestern. Her 40 pages of the Daily Northwestern with her piece on it were written in blood red, with her name on each one, and her
she crossed the
email address. So she crossed the line. But wait a second. The university defended it as free speech.
Of course.
Never would they do that if it were the verse. Just think about.
Well, it would be called academic freedom.
Right.
So remember the way this plays out, right? It's free speech and academic freedom. But if there's an attack in any way on persons of color, then instantly what happens is it's hate speech.
Well, but it should be hate. This should have been hate speech too.
I know,
the
but
problem is, except for the Jews.
Right.
And that's what I found again and again and again, is that in reading academics, you can almost put in and David Adele deserves some credit, Jews don't count.
Right.
Well, in academia, they certainly don't count because they are lifted to be the hyper oppressors at the top of the pyramid of people who are wronging the rest of society.
Right, and you pick up this up. So anyway, we'll get to this other piece too about where you pick this up. But let's talk a little about, because I think you're right. We should set up. It's like a brief written by a former student about his university, by focusing on a far right person, in this case Butts, who wrote this Holocaust denial book. And more recently, he's focusing on someone who was hired in the journalism or humanities department, a guy named Thrasher, who has, from the left progressive side, his objections to and justifications for anti-Semitism masquerading as a human rights issue on anti-Semitism. So there's really two conspiracies from left and right on the extreme edges, and they both have very different things to say, but they're united in one thing. So let's just, first of all, before we get to Thrasher, the concept of conspiracies is important to just explain.
Okay, so here's the thing that is important to explain about conspiracy theories, because actually some of the things I've been talking about in the general media and the light have just been on conspiracy theories, not about the Jews necessarily. Conspiracy theories are very dangerous. And by the way, the research is pretty clear. Once someone gets into a conspiracy theory and becomes convinced of it, it's very, very hard to get them out. QAnon advocates, or adherents, not advocates, QAnon advocates, and I mean, I can go through and through. You can't even convince. I've had conversations with people about the Denver airport conspiracy theory. And if someone's drank the Kool-Aid, you can't actually get them out of it. No matter what you say, they've got another point. So here's the thing to know.
Well, can I just say something? Yeah. What you point out a lot, and is that what you say very repeatedly, is that you can't get them out of it for part, because if you show them evidence of it.
Well, that's where I'm going.
Right.
So just like Arthur Butts, anytime there's a new fact, the conspiracy expands around that fact. So people are saying there's a Holocaust. Now they show evidence that people are confessing to it, confessing to being perpetrators. Well, that's because this evil cabal, in this case Jews, most of the time Jews, have bamboozled, hypnotized, bribed, whatever, this group. So that's no longer the
evidence is evidence of the
conspiracy, right? The evidence is
this
evidence
is our
of
program, but thank you very much.
The evidence is evidence of the conspiracy.
Right.
So the countervailing evidence is evidence of the conspiracy. So that keeps happening. The same thing about documents, the same thing about QAnon. If you go through and find out where Q was, either gone or things didn't happen, well, the conspiracy theory expands around it. In Denver, every time you prove and take photographs of what's going on with the conveyor belts for luggage, well, the conspiracy theory just expands around it.
But you, in the book, you point out that there are some conspiracies, like, for instance, the Red Scare. Right. Let's just remind people that there have been other examples of this.
Political examples. And I also want to say something that's critical. And it's extraordinarily, I mean, we have to do this, particularly in this day and age. There are conspiracy theories, and then there are theories about conspiracies. There have been conspiracies to do harm to people, such as the Tuskegee vaccination, so-called vaccination, medical experiments, such as the CIA using LSD on people. You can have a theory about a conspiracy, and that's okay. But then you have to do the analysis. And if actually you find documents that countervail it, you find testimony that countervails it, you have to accept the results. A conspiracy theorist never will do that, because again, it always will expand around.
But it's also important, and you point this out in the book, where when you use the word cabal, it's very important to think about it in legalistic terms, which is that as in criminal conspiracy, you have to have a meeting, an agreement to confer in an illegal act, right? So so conspiracies that actually took place, right? the Wannsee Conference.
Right, the Wannsee
The
Conference.
Wannsee Conference actually was a meeting that took place, and it ended up with the final solution. Right.
And it was minuted.
Right.
Amazingly.
So you have to, in instances when you're dealing with Zionism or the all power of Jews, you have to actually say that there was a meeting. There's
Right.
evidence of a meeting that took place. And that's what's, really interesting, that when it comes to Jews, even Kanye West, right? He points out that the original studio heads, 5 of the 7 were Jewish, and Jews still are very prominent in Hollywood. But that's different from saying that Jews actually have a meeting, and at the meeting they've decided that African Americans shouldn't be in movies. Right.
Or at Northwestern, that there are moles in classes monitoring professors. That's paranoid.
Right.
That's actually paranoid. I mean, there's a Northwestern University professor who wrote a book that uses campus Hillel rabbis in quotes, because they're not really quotes. They're not really campus Hillel rabbis, that talks about how the Jews are oppressing the anthropology discipline, are making tenure decisions. She does, along with her co-author, a massive analysis, finds no evidence of it at the end, none, and admits it. And then says, this is proof of how bad this is.
Now,
You would say that instead of an academic theory, that person needs another sort of help.
And the reason this is important is because you talk about something else. You talk about both the golden rule and the motto.
Right.
Comes up throughout the book.
Right.
Because in many ways, conspiracy theories are the enemy of that idea, right? The concept. So explain how this plays out. Like why are conspiracies dangerous? Because they violate the very essence of the golden rule.
Right. So the fundamental, and what I argue for in the book, is Hillel's formulation of the golden rule. Don't do what is hateful to you to somebody else. It's the most modest form of the rule. And it generally, I've never actually found a place that it doesn't work. If you think you wouldn't like it, trying to figure out what someone else would like, doing to others as you want done to you, is hard because you actually don't know the other person. You know yourself. And you know that if someone's going to make a report about you, they should have some evidence. They should have some proof. But what happens is that the other people, capital O, are not really people. They belong to, if you're in the conspiracy theory, it's very similar to being in a cult, being in an idolatrous group, where your God King Pharaoh has special knowledge. One interesting thing about conspiracy theories that I found in the research is that people who are into them feel like they're special because only they actually understand reality around them. Other people don't. So they want to nurse that, and knowing that other people don't know that, they're somehow inferior.
But how does that violate the golden rule?
Because they aren't treating someone the way they would want to be treated. That other person, Simon sitting over there, would not want to be treated as though we knew something about you that you don't know. You presumably have some self-knowledge, and that's bottom line what the Northwestern motto is, which is relies on good report, relies on actually doing the analysis, figuring out if someone's being treated fairly and accurately. And believe me, people wouldn't want to do that. And my belief is that every persecution, every sort of true evil comes out of a violation of the golden rule. Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example that spans what I said. So what is idolatry and what is this cult? It's about assuming that your ideology, your God King leader, your whatever, your idolatry, it has some sort of superpower, super authority, super knowledge.
In the book, you talk about deification.
Deification, right. So all, of course, backed up by theater, something, myth, pageantry, and usually some enforcement actions, secret armies, secret police. So Pharaoh, how did he get away with what he got away with? In the Bible, the story of throwing the Israelite babies into the river with the goal of having the women be sex slaves. How did he get away with that? Nobody questioned that until like the 5th plague. because he was the God King Pharaoh. How did Stalin get away with starving a quarter of the Ukraine, killing all the kulaks first, sending tens of millions to the gulag, and nobody questioned him? Mao killing 75 million, responsible for the murder and death of 75 million of his comrades, and nobody questioned him because they were God King Pharaohs. How did Jonestown happen? Because they were God King Pharaohs. And how do ideologies on a macro basis, on even a micro basis happen? How did Charlie Rose and Harvey Weinstein get away with what they got away with? Because on an intimate basis, they were God Kings at CBS or in Hollywood or wherever, and they were unquestioned and unquestionable. That's what's happening, sadly, and on campus and more broadly. And it makes me want to cry.
But again, it doesn't fit well. And maybe now's the time to talk about Thrasher.
Yes,
because it's not like at universities everyone is uniting around a person, an idolatry of a person, a deification. They're rallying around something else, right? Ideology about Jews or anti-Zionism, which fits into this sort of pattern of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-racist.
Yes.
Israel somehow got swept up in the whole movement of intersectionality and the entire movement of critical race theory. And you point out many examples, right, that where issues related to people of color were being hijacked by the Palestinian cause.
Right.
Whether it's the murder of George Floyd or was it the Muslim travel ban? Somehow in those debates, it was all came back to Israel. That Israel, you have this really funny line in the book where you say somehow Israel's responsible for American racism.
Yes.
And you have a great line. You're going, so Israel was created in 1948, and the New York Times said American racism starts in 1619. So how is it possible that Israel's responsible for something that happened in 1619? So what is it? What's the idolatry? Let's put
it is
on the left. What's the idolatry?
The idolatry is this ideology that does carry some superpower, super authority, which is one of the things I've said and talk about in the book. And they have various God Kings. There are God Kings. Angela Davis came up with this concept of Ferguson is Gaza, and that it's like a concentration camp. Now, once she said it, and I've read her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, for Ferguson and Gaza, that became taken up by everybody. Stephen Thrasher essentially is repeating lines from her book.
But there's just such an absurdity to some of this. Like, for instance, there was a time where people would say, well, blood libels could never take place now, because everyone knows that matzah is terrible on its own, and you don't need blood to make it worse, right? So, and if you're in a university, right? If you're in a university, at least you know that,
right? But people don't know any of that,
right? But so for instance, like one of the people you were talking about, and it's toward the end of the book, you're talking about how, okay, so if it comes to, well, what is Israel doing? Right. Well, they're harvesting organs.
Yes, that's one of the things.
Deliberately maiming people.
Using their technology to hack the DNA of Palestinians to starve them.
Stunting the growth of Palestinians. This is in universities. There are books, stunting the growth, maiming. Now, I can say one of the reasons that those are persuasive arguments is because annoyances like me, because I love to walk around, go around the country and I say, do you all realize that the Palestinian population has doubled since the occupation? And how is that ethnic cleansing? You can't ethnic cleanse, you can't genocide and double. It's not a multiplication process. It has to be subtraction. So now you say, oh, well, maybe, okay, it's not an ethnic cleansing, but it's maiming, it's harvesting organs. And you talk about this, which, believe me, it was horrifying, what happened in Vassar, where the Pujar
was Professor Pujar,
where she literally uses the harvesting organs and gets a standing ovation. This is a university, and you're saying, wait, people didn't run out to the back to tell the president that this was being said on a campus of harvesting organs? So again, there's a crazy making element to this, but especially because it's a university.
But like an infomercial, I can say, but there's more.
Yeah.
Because that book was published, where she says all of those things, by Duke University Press.
Yeah.
It won Best Book of the Year award by the Women's Studies Association. And those words are quoted when I talk about Northwestern. They are continually quoted at Northwestern. But
as if it's dogma.
As if it's dogma. And here's another book that a hero of Stephen Thrasher, who he cites a lot, Stephen Saleta, who wrote a book, Israel's Dead Soul, again published by Duke University Press, as it turns out. And he says, the Nazi Holocaust in Europe seems a direct antecedent to Israel's founding. There were plans from the outset of Zionism to rid the promised land of its indigenous population. Now, I could almost take, and this is why I wanted to come to this line. I could almost find that line. It's not exactly in Arthur Butts' book.
Yeah.
And so the thing that's striking is the commonality of language used by the far right and far left, focusing on Israel. For the far right, Jews are causing harm to whites. For the far left, Jews are causing harm to all people of color. For the far right, Jews are fake whites. They're actually people of color using their fake white skin to infiltrate.
They're not part of the master
poor,
race.
unsuspecting white people. For the far left, Jews are
Hyper white.
uber white. Exactly. They're at the top of that pyramid. And if you just change some words, that's the thing that just struck me as I was reading these books, with a finer tooth comb that I would normally do, is that they are interchangeable except for picking the victim. It's like one of those, where you used to take your kids on a drive and they had Mad Libs. You just switch some of the names and you could rewrite the book. And instead of being published by Duke University Press, it could be published by the Institute for Historical Research, which is a far right crazy place.
Okay, but here's where they split, right?
Yeah.
Where they really split are a couple of things that are super important. First one that you point out in the book, and you do it repeatedly, is that on the far right, there's nothing Jews can do to get out of this problem, right? Because Jews are essentially the enemy of white people. They're not white, and we need a final solution. So this is part of the Hitler's final solution. But on the left, as long as Jews, and I used to joke about this all the time in all my years of teaching, I used to say, if you don't come into the faculty lounge and openly declare that Israel is the worst human rights violator in the history of the world, worse than the Huns, the Nazis, if you don't say that, you don't get fruit cup.
Right.
Forget the fruit cup. It's not happening to you.
Right.
If you say that, you've now said the right script. And if you don't say that, you're a pariah here. So the left at least says, and this explains why there's so many Jewish professors that bash Israel,
right?
Because they're allowed to, right? You couldn't, the right wouldn't let Jews in anyway, but at least the left, you got to give them credit. They'll say, as long as you're a Jew that disavows who you are, just tell everyone the truth. Jews are terrible people. They're evil. They're terrible. And Israel's the worst human rights violator. And then we love you. That's a person who we will honor as a Jew. And then people can't believe that this has happened. And then the second thing, and I think this is very important, because I have a friend here who needs to hear this, but I'm not going to give the name, needs to hear this. One of the things that's very important, which you don't really talk that much about in the book, which is that Butts is alone. The right-wing Holocaust hoax crackpots don't really exist on university campus. Yeah, they exist in Indiana and Montana and Washington State, and they join QAnon and they're on these really weird websites, and they're out there, but they don't own the university. In fact, they have no credibility in university, no traction. There are no books they're writing, there are no scholars. There's Butts, which was extraordinary that he did this because he was as you said, he was a rock star. But the rock stars are all on the right, on the left, right? And so that's really, so when you talk about mainstream media, when you talk about publishing, when you talk about universities, it's overwhelming that they're in the category of Angela Davis or Steve Saleta or Thrasher. they're not in any way in alignment with the right-wing hatred of Jews. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say this, though. I don't know the precise percentages because faculty at universities, some of them may be on the far right, but they are good at covering it up. So Professor Butts is an exception, you're right, but there's a professor who was a professor of psychology at McDonald at the University of California who is now one of the leaders of the alt-right. He waited until he retired, then he came out and he's also brandishing his academic credibility on the far right. There was a neuroscience researcher at Northwestern who was outed as a far right person. He ended up committing suicide. So he was doing fine until it was discovered that his Twitter handle, Caveman Bart, was really this neuroscience researcher. And once that came out, it was so bad he committed suicide. So you're right. I do also want to make one point.
But do you really think that there's more of a critical mass?
I think there's more than we know because they recognize you can't
say it.
Being on the far right is even worse than being Jewish on campus. I mean,
yeah.
You better be quiet. And you know, I'm not advocating for Holocaust deniers to be on campus. Don't get me wrong, but they know they've got to cloak themselves very, very well.
But I think that's what's even worse than that.
Yeah.
What you described, and you do say this in the book repeatedly, is something that again most people don't understand and do a good job with this, which is the anti-colonial obsession.
Yep.
Right, on university campuses, right? So this is another area where Israel gets hooked in. It is a anti-European, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist perspective, and that it's perceived as part of the white world, the white oppressor. And so Israel falls into the category of the European white oppressor. And one of the things that you say in the book, which was really original, I thought, which is, who's decided that imperialists are only Europeans? Where did that come? And you point out repeatedly, and you can explain that imperialism is also among people of color. It's not just Europeans.
Well, I think this is why this isn't just a battle for the Jews. It's actually a battle, and it goes back to the Northwestern motto. It goes back to truth. It goes back to understanding actual facts as opposed to made-up facts and conspiracy theories, is that we now live in a time when students are not being taught that there was a Ottoman Empire, a great Arabic empire that took over half of India, the Mughals regime over half of India. The Chinese history is unexplainable unless you understand the Han Chinese imperialist. And I'm not criticizing it, but it's just unintelligible. But Russian Empire, and yet somehow that's all put aside, and there's only one bad empire, and that's European.
And it's Winston Churchill.
Right.
It's pretty much about Churchill. Like, you know, remember when President Obama removed the bust of Churchill from the Oval Office? That was
because he committed the sin of saving Western civilization.
Right. But you know, I think people don't realize, you know, if you're a Churchill scholar, that's the worst thing you want to be. You can't on a campus say that you're a Churchill scholar. And I think what you're saying is that it's because everything is framed in terms of the British Empire and European conquests of people of color. And there is no recognition that imperialism exists everywhere.
Yeah, look, Churchill did some bad things and Churchill said some good things. But if you're a historian, you actually write that. You don't say we're just going to excise him or make a judgment, but you have to understand the rest of empire. And you have to understand what indigeneity is. I mean, you can't look at a stele from 1250 BCE that actually now has been reconfirmed to be referring to Jews and say that somehow Jews parachuted in to Israel or to the land of Israel sort of post 1870 or something, whatever Salata says. Yeah, whatever Salata says. And you can't actually understand history unless you realize the Arabs were a great empire, started in the Arabian Peninsula, took over the land of Israel, took over. It took over a lot of the Middle East, had tremendous impact. And you have to understand, they were an empire. That's why so many people speak Arabic. I mean, that's the other definition of empire, is who speaks the language, because the other languages are oppressed. Basic things like that are not intelligible.
Well, you tell a story, you say, that you can't say that in the United States. Right. No immigrant comes to this country and speaks the language of the country naturally. Right. It's not their motherland's country. That's the whole point of America, unless they speak some native Indian American language. Right. But when it comes to Israel, there is, and you say this, and I think it's interesting because I think, isn't Ramaz in this building?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think you also blame, not just university education, but that just ignorance about Jewish history. That Jewish history is sort of really Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig.
Right. It's Ashkenaz normative too much.
Yeah, it's focused again on not biblical history. Yeah. It's not focused on Hebrew. It's focused on, Kafka, Jews of Europe. So of course, if that's all you're talking about, that the Jews of Europe ended up somehow winding up in Israel, there you see, they're land grabbers. They don't belong there. And there's no basis for it, and I just think that, and this is another thing that, I've said publicly for a number of years, in this room, probably everyone knows this, but that the line about, how many times is Jerusalem mentioned in the Old Testament? I think it's 677 times. And how many times is Jerusalem mentioned in the Quran? Not once.
Right.
Not once. And you're going, how is Jerusalem so important to you if you forgot to put it in your book? Because when it came to our book, the Old Testament, we put it in 677 times. And we're not indigenous to this land, right? And yet that's the argument, right? And so the point is we're not actually allowed to have this argument because of what you also say in the book is this, maybe that's what you mean by idolatry, this extraordinary impulse to groupthink.
That's what I'm saying. Your group has some special knowledge of empire, of the way history works, of how to define things in terms of what colonialism is and what colonialism isn't. And that's really what, as opposed to fact-based, let's just look at the friggin' facts, then argue opinions. And one thing that I've seen is very different is I had professors who were definitely at Northwestern who were Marxists, but they could sit in a room at the time in the 70s and early 80s and have an argument. You can't do that anymore. Now, if you don't accept the terms, you are just excluded from the conversation, you're canceled. So the analogy to what I said about idolatry having the secret police with enforcement power is just done economically right now, because if you don't agree, you're gone. I mean, professors who don't cleanse their resume of any Zionist or Israel visits. There are even archaeology professors who can't dig in Israel anymore because that'll cost them tenure.
Right. So you just reminded me a couple things. I think you credit, when we talk about Angela Davis, I think it's interesting. We think of Arafat as a terrorist because he deserves to be thought of as, but his contribution is much better. Oh, yeah. He was far more powerful, not as a terrorist, but as someone who redefined these issues.
He really is underrated as sort of from an intellectual perspective of redefining pan-Arabism. Don't forget, before Arafat, before 1964, if you referred to Palestinians, you were probably referring to Jews.
Of course.
The Palestine Post was the Jerusalem Post. You were probably referring to Jews.
Oh, no. And also remember that time period, the Jordanians were occupying the West Bank, right, and no one said anything about the word occupation.
So this was an Arab, and the reason that it's important to understand the Arab Empire is this was an Arab project to retake Arabic Empire land. And it was understandable under that rubric. But Arafat, to his credit, intellectually understood the power of nationalism, understood the power of liberation movements, and understood that the Soviet Union could be extremely helpful here. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to this again, but he essentially was part of this in terms of the Soviet encyclopedia. I think is just amazing because it, let's see if I can find, here it is. So this is what's the Great Soviet Encyclopedia is saying. Now, by the way, since the fall of the Soviet Union, we know the people writing this knew they were making it up and making lies. But look at this. The main posits of modern Zionism are militant chauvinism, racism, anti-communism, and anti-Sovietism. The anti-human reactionary essence is Zionism. It's a covert and overt fight against freedom movements. And then it goes on to international Zionists own the major funds and control the banks, et cetera, and they serve as the front squad of colonialism and neo-colonialism and are actively participating in the fights against Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He was part of that. He deserves some credit.
Well, I mean,
for really redefining the terms.
Well, he anticipated what we see now, which is that somehow the crimes of Ferguson or the crimes in Minneapolis, the killing of George Floyd, is Israel's fault.
Yes.
Why? Because some cops, not necessarily from Minnesota, took counterterrorism, not tactics, but went to Israel to learn counterterrorism techniques. And somehow now the knee on the throat of a person of color was invented by Jews. Right. And you're going, nobody can possibly believe
and
this.
Everybody does.
Yeah, but that's
the God King Pharaoh part, because it's said by someone and then everybody accepts it.
But again, in some ways, our thought introduces that idea. All right, before we take a couple questions from the audience, and we've got to say goodnight and sell some books here. Your kid, I think Ben is here, your son, he's a graduate of Northwestern. You haven't divested yourself of Northwestern, but I think it's fair to say
they've divested themselves of me.
Right. They have profoundly continued to disappoint you.
Yes.
Right. They won't stop.
Right.
Right. I mean, they won't stop. BDS resolutions, right? And university seems to be very silent on all of this. Right. And in the book at the end, you actually talk about things that even Jewish trustees say. And I think it's important, since we're in a synagogue. And you know it's my favorite line in the book. Why don't you tell the audience what Northwestern Jewish trustees said?
So in doing the research and in being involved in the anti-BDS resolution group back in 2015, actually some trustees reached out to me, which was surprising, and I encouraged them to be more public. Why are you calling me? What are you actually going to accomplish by talking to me, other than saying "I Gewalt" and the like? One professor said to me, "I'm going to stop." Well, not professor. One trustee said to me, "I'm no longer going to donate to endowed professorships because I see how these folks can become anti-Semitic under my name. I'm now going to only give to buildings, because a building can't become anti-Semitic." The person is still giving money to the university. One person, and this is, I think, the quote you're talking about, said that he wanted to do this. He was on the board because of the prestige. It's more prestigious to me to be on the Northwestern University Board of Trustees than to be, and he was quoting the Chicago Standard Club at the time, a big prestigious, like the Met, like the Metropolitan Club here in New York, that was more prestigious, and it gave him value. I had conversations with 3 or 4 Jewish trustees, and actually a couple of non-Jewish trustees. The non-Jewish trustees were oblivious to what was going on, but they actually took it seriously once I spoke to them and said they would talk to the president at least and figure out what to do. But in the end, it's easier to fit in. It's, there is the prestige value. I mean, if you look at lists of donations, the bulk of donations, I think the second largest recipient of donations are universities. There's nothing more prestigious than putting your name on a building at a university or a school or the like.
Tell the story, and then we'll take a question. Tell the story of the Latin American student.
Oh, that really almost made me cry.
It's very tragic.
Right. So and I reprinted the letter in the appendix, but during the work against the Northwestern BDS resolution, I co-signed it with someone, and we were co-signing with a third person. This was at the time a sophomore, a girl, Hispanic girl, not Jewish, who was passionate about what was going on,
because it was unfair.
It was unfair, and she just was a regular person who was reading the facts and couldn't believe that Jews are being vilified once again. So the she had actually part of this. She had drafted the actual letter, and it was all good. I mean, we were in complete contact. Then, just before it was due to be published, she called me crying, really crying tearfully, saying she couldn't have her name on it because she was told by her friends. She told friends what she was doing. It was going to be public, and they said, "You cannot sign this letter. None of us will be your friends anymore, and you will not participate in any organization that we have anything to do with." They basically bullied her, threatened her. It was a secret police, as it were, and it worked. And I remember her crying. And I didn't try to convince her to sign because it's far be it from me, some
To
person
make her life
to make
miserable.
her life miserable.
Right.
It was just, it wouldn't have been appropriate. So we removed the last edit was removed. Literally, the last edit was removing this young woman's name.
Let's take some questions and we'll say goodnight to Scott. Anybody got something? Did we scare the crap out of you? I think that's. I think that it is really hard to hear.
Yeah.
And it's also surreal. I'll get to stuff. I think it's, I know this from years where when I was at NYU and people would say, you know, Thane, I understand you're, what they go, they would literally say to me, NY Jew?
Right.
And as if to say, what you're saying can't be true. There's actually something very interesting. There's a nice little connection here because you may remember it was a few years ago that it was like the perfect storm at NYU. 3 things happened at the same time. And one of those things had to do with Thrasher.
Right.
Your guy from Northwestern
Right.
gave a speech. He was the commencement speaker for the graduate school. You may remember this. It's that guy who's now at Northwestern.
Right.
In his speech said, Israel's an apartheid state, Israel's a genocidal nation, and got standing ovations.
Yep.
Right?
Hoots and hollers. It's on YouTube.
Yeah, you can actually go watch it. Standing ovations. That's the guy who's now at Northwestern.
Right.
And so there's sort of a linkage. Yes.
What do you make of conspiracy theories becoming like a more general popular form of mainstream media, like with Joe Rogan's podcast or something like that, or maybe it's not even necessarily for your own story?
Yes, I think that is a serious problem because in mainstream media, you can get away with things so easily. So to equate money and pizza and to say somehow Jews love money the way Italians love pizza, which, by the way, we first had pizza here in the United States and then they got popular in Italy. To conflate what is easy to do for a Joe Rogan is to put together essentially unlinked things. Like, actually, who's to say I'm a banker? I meet a lot of non-Jews. I actually don't know that Jews like money any better than any other.
Well,
group.
Rogan likes money.
Rogan makes $4 million a month.
And he's not Jewish.
There you go. And who's to say that Jews aren't more? Actually, if you look at the list of people giving to all of these universities, I think you could come up with pretty good anecdotal and even statistical evidence beyond anecdotal that Jews are actually quite generous and maybe more, and actually more generous than the population as a whole. But in mainstream media, if you just say something and a person like Joe Rogan says something, it becomes accepted. And here's the problem, and it's a serious problem. There was a study of 1,131 human resource professionals. So a real amount of, a real significant, statistically significant study of human resource professionals. I think I'm getting the number right. If it's not, I'm off by only a little. 29% said it's okay to discriminate against Jews. That's the mainstreaming. 38% said that if there's anti-Semitism in the workplace, it's not such a big deal. I have personally been at meetings with people who are running billion-dollar entities that have started to morph off into saying something anti-Semitic. And I can't believe it because I literally can't believe it because they are generally aware that I'm Jewish, and I'll stop them. And I'm gonna intervene at that point. But the mainstreaming and the reason why Joe Rogan is so dangerous is that the more this becomes just part of the air and acceptable, the more we have to worry. And it's the fact that people are being taught at university that Israel is bad and anything it does is bad and tropes about Jews. And then those folks come out and are running human resource departments. And those folks are journalists at the New York Times, where not only don't they like Israel, but nobody they know likes Israel, and nobody they know really wants to look at the truth. We're in trouble. And I have to say, and I say this to some degree in the articles, but I have actually never been as worried in my adult lifetime as I am today because of this mainstreaming. It started in the universities, and you have to give the BDS people a lot of credit for figuring out if you can start in the university, start teaching the people who are teaching it. That's how it can get to K through 12, and that's how it can get further on, and that's how it can get into investments. I've been involved in the pushback against ESG becoming hijacked by BDS advocates. BDS advocates probably range in the United States from 2 to 5% of the population, yet they control the universities, and I think that's fair enough to say. And they're trying, then they figured out if they can get it ESG, boy, they'll control the investments.
But what they know is, and what they exploit is just the general ignorance.
Yeah.
And a natural predisposition to hate Jews. Because again, the Israelis taught Derek Chauvin to put his knee on George. Really? That's right. It's the simplicity. In fact, you talk about the conspiracies that very simplified explanations.
Right. They're always oversimplified.
Oversimplified. This is the reason. The reason, Angela Davis says, the reason there are so many African Americans in American prisons is because of what Israel does to the Palestinians. What? And she literally says, that's the connection.
Right.
What Israel does to Palestinians somehow directs white Americans to put African Americans in our prisons.
That's exactly, by the way, going back to the God King Pharaoh. If you read Stephen Thrasher, he just changes a few words and says the exact same thing without evidence again, but footnoting Angela Davis.
Yeah.
So Angela Davis invents something, then she's footnoted.
I was watching New York One the other day, and then we'll take one last question. I was New York One, and somebody was talking about either BDS or apartheid, and it was a New York. I don't remember his name. He was insignificant, but he's on New York One, and he immediately said, "Yes, but you realize what we did with South Africa, we should absolutely do with Israel." And because he just accepted, this is a New York One anchor, he accepted that Israel's an apartheid state. It's very simple.
Right.
I've been told it, and it's got to be true. It's an apartheid state. And so therefore, if this is the boycott, if it's the same boycott that ended apartheid in South Africa, then we need another apartheid another boycott to end the apartheid in Israel. And that idea, unfortunately, I've had to write too much about this stuff and speak too much about this. The amount of public ignorance is astounding. No, it's really astounding. Like, people don't know anything about anything. I had some guy, Irish faculty member, this is a faculty member, said to me, he says, "You know why we from Ireland, why we hate Israelis?" So he wanted me to know. And I said, do I need to know this? He said, "Yeah, well, I said, "Yes, I know the Irish really hate Israelis." So he said, this is what he said. This is a faculty member. He said, because in 1967, when Israel became a country, that was his first sentence, right out of the box.
Right.
He got the first thing it did was go into Palestine and steal Arab land. And then I said, you really got to do a lot more reading. I said, I don't know what to say to you. I said, every single word, it's impossible to say that the word "the" is wrong. Every single thing you just said, and you're at a university.
Right.
And then you know what he said to me? That's what you say. I'm glad we taped that because that was what he said. That's what you say. So there's no way to win this. All right. Last question, and we'll say goodnight to Scott.
So I think we have to, the question is, how do we counter it? So I think the answer is, sadly, it's not, we can't do it ourselves. As Jews alone, we have to find allies, and we have to think about allies. We're here before Purim, so I'll give you just one little Purim story. In the book of Esther, Mordecai asks Esther, go to the king and tell him the Jews are going to be killed and stop this. And what does she say? I'm paraphrasing. That's a stupid idea. If I go there and say that he's just going to, I haven't been there, he's just going to lop off my head. That's a dumb idea. It's only later when she comes up with a plan to convince Ahasuerus that Haman is actually after the kingship and that this is his problem, that this guy is killing, wants to murder the Jews. That's the turnaround of the whole story. And what we need to do, and that's why it's so important that we talk about, and I emphasize this in the book, that it's so important that we talk about being on the side of real history. Let's teach. If you want to learn about imperialism, let's teach imperialism. Let's not teach a fantasy. We have to be on the side of making this about an argument, not an argument about academic freedom, real, not fantasy academic, fake academic freedom. And if we don't do that, and we always just are, and we're just saying Gewalt, it's the Jews, we're not going to succeed. So we need allies. Well, we don't have a lot.
There is one other thing that can be done, and we don't have time to talk about that today. But most people in this room probably have not heard about the relatively new definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. Yes. It's been adopted by 33 countries, including the American State Department. President Biden had promised in December to codify it and have it implemented through all federal agencies. He didn't do it. He was thanked by the members of the squad. They all tweeted President Biden, thank you for not adopting this evil thing. Because the international, and remember, this is 33 countries, and it emanated out of the European Union. So it didn't even come from the United States. It came from them. It came from, I think, a Swedish or Swiss premier who just saw this incredible ignorance about the Holocaust. And he said, we need a definition of anti-Semitism. And all I can say is it is much broader, so that if you take a position that only one country in the world has no right to exist and the Jews don't have a right to self-determination, that is not a political opinion. That's anti-Semitism, right? It calls it for what it is. If that's what your position is, that there's only one country that's going to be singled out that doesn't deserve a state, you're actually an anti-Semite. You're not an academic, you're an anti-Semite. If you're holding Israel to a double standard, right, that you would not hold to another country, you're an anti-Semite.
Right.
Why is it important? If you, and there are more categories of this. If you call Israel a racist nation or compare them to Nazis, you're anti-Semite. Why is this important? Because under Title VI, it would eliminate federal funding. And that goes for even Northwestern as private schools. Why? Because the Civil Rights Act has been interpreted, I hate to say this, you have to thank Donald Trump for this, the idea of nationality of Jews as a people, right? They're not just a religion. They're also an ethnicity and a people. When you're discriminating, not just on the basis of sex, race, and nationality, nationality would then include the Jewish people and their connection to Israel. So this is something that nobody's talking about, but they really should be. You should be all over your congresspersons. You should be saying, adopt this definition, because that would strip academic freedom, because that would essentially saying, no, don't call it for what you're, it's not, you can do that, but you've just endangered the university of losing its funding. And that's exactly what the Department of Education did to Duke and University of North Carolina. They hosted a conference on the Middle East. They invited no pro-Israel speakers. The entire 2 days was just a bashing of Israel as an apartheid state. And guess what? The Department of Education did an investigation and stripped them of funding. And that's what they deserve. That's not an academic place. I'm sorry. To me, if you went to Duke, you should be embarrassed.
They still might have gotten away with it if they hadn't had the video posted of everybody yelling, kill the Jews, which you can find on YouTube.
Yeah, you can actually see. All right. Scott Shay's new book, everybody, Conspiracy U. Get the book. Thank you. That was fun. He wrote. Scott will be signing books. If you're interested in Folks events, folks.org, folcs.org. Sign up for our email lists. This was just the sort of thing that we do all the time. So if this was interesting to you, join our community. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Professor. Enjoyed it very much. Very good. Thank you again.
Thank you.
No, the funny thing is,
All right, let me get